Hello? I sure can.
Thank you. I have to do this publicly. Read this to ensure Libby, our colleague Libby Garvey, joins the meeting. So I have been notified by Libby Garvey that she is unable to attend today's meeting because of a temporary disability that prevents her physically attending the meeting, and that she would like to participate by phone from her South 14th Street address in Arlington. This is allowed by law, and the board's policy and arrangements have been made for her participation. So I will ask the clerk to record Libby's notification in the minutes of today's meeting. Okay, thank you, Hope. Welcome, Libby. You're there, correct?
I'm here. Thank you, Jay.
Okay. All right. So everyone, welcome. Welcome to those in attendance and those watching us as well. I'm just going to say a couple of brief words because there's a lot of material for today's meeting. I have two things really to just frame up. One is that the agenda before us is robust. There's a lot here. Some of this is about really educating all of us. I've been here a while, but I still get confused sometimes regarding the different types of enforcement that our staff in various places do and the different approaches to that enforcement. So today, the meeting is broken down into the staff presentation in a number of areas, and then I'll make sure we stay on time enough to allow for a very significant portion of time to have discussion. So if the presentation starts going too long and it looks like we're eating into discussion, don't be surprised if I say pick up the pace or we're going to cut it off and then go into the discussion. So just keep it moving. And I know there's a lot of information that you all have to communicate, so we're aware of that too. The other thing is that as you look at the agenda, I want to reiterate, this is not a meeting to discuss any particular code enforcement infraction. Today's discussion is not to talk about a particular constituent's concern. Now, to the degree we're talking about issues related to code enforcement, broadly speaking, and some of the issues that surface through board constituent stuff, and we use something as an example to understand better how things are done or dealt with, that's fine. But we're not here today to solve any particular site issue. And with that, everybody's here. I'm going to turn it over to Mark to, say a few words as well before we launch into the presentations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as you highlighted, today's work session is about achieving a better understanding of code enforcement responsibilities in Arlington. And we'll talk about the legal authority for the operation, organization, and how we have interagency relationships and protocols for dealing with private properties. And I'm hoping that that information will help people get a better understanding and backdrop for some of the specific issues that have come up. And as you pointed out, we're not going to be talking about individual cases. Our code enforcement section is located in the Inspection Services Division of the Department of Community Planning, Housing, and Development. And this section is led by Mr. Gary Green, who's right here next to me. And he's worked for the county for the past 16 years. And next to him is Shariar Amiri, our building official and Inspection Services Division Chief. And he's also available today to answer any questions. We also have Arlo Vaughn with us, who's our zoning administrator, and Andy Penn, who may at various times be answering some questions related to some enforcement issues. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary for the presentation.
Thank you, and thank you to the board for this opportunity to provide clarity and realign some of the perceptions about code enforcement here in Arlington. Just in the way of groundwork, our primary purpose today is to provide an overview of code enforcement agencies here in the county and take a brief look into, as the manager provided to some degree so far, our legal authority, organization, our work protocols, some of the interagency relationships that make our agency work, and secondly, to open a discussion about recent concerns elevated by this body and some members of the community. After a brief background of the agency, organization, and operation, and staff will visit some of the specific work of the agency and clarify what, importantly, we do, what we don't do, challenges to the effectiveness of the program, some recent concerns, and conclude with a brief summary. A little bit about who we are. Something unusual for the day is I've got the code enforcement section here with me. I'm going to ask them to stand. It's actually very rare for them to all be in the same place at the same time. But I wanted to take the opportunity just so that you can just look at them one time. Thank you very much. You may be seated. I'm particularly proud of this group who oft work silently with little recognition or thanks. The work is complex. It's a hard job. And this, again, may be the very first time that many of you have ever seen them together. They're not going to show up on a website or on a poster, but they're working kind of silently in the background to get work done. A bit about the code enforcement section itself. As you can see from the diagram, we sit in the Inspection Services Division as part of CPHD, Community Planning and Housing Development Department. Zoning is another agency that is part of that agency, and we work very closely. Zoning has a separate enforcement unit that I'll talk about in a little bit of detail a little later on. The group that I just had stand has both an administrative or technical and a technical support staff. So the administrative staff would support the building of cases, the answering of phones, processing of documents, helping with court case, and the administration of an elevator program that has recently been added to the unit. The 8 inspectors actually report to 2 code enforcement supervisors that work in a technical team. A little bit of information here. All 14 of the inspectors have some form of certification. The inspections, the field inspectors, have an ICC certification. That's the International Code Council's certification as housing and property maintenance inspectors. They also are certified by the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development as building maintenance inspectors. That certification is maintained through the Virginia Building Code Academy, Jack Proctor Building Code Academy out of Richmond. They're all FEMA certified in disaster inspection specialties. And they are certified recently, since we adopted the noise control ordinance, in noise enforcement through Rutgers University. I'll provide more information about that as we go forward. 2 of our staff members are Department of Housing and Community Development State Certified Code Academy instructors. It's actually rare, given the size of our unit, that 2 of the staff would actually be carrying that type of weight with them. And 50% of the staff are multilingual. They speak 8 languages, from Tagalog, Spanish, Sign Language, Portuguese, Vietnamese, Arabic, French, German, and Italian. That's helped us to be able to communicate effectively with our constituents and actually to be able to be culturally sensitive, important considering how Arlington has grown and developed. We do a lot of work primarily with the zoning enforcement unit, and we work with a number of other agencies, including fire, police, the county attorney's office, which we meet with biweekly, the Commonwealth Attorney, Department of Human Services as it would relate to the organizations or the help that we would need to provide to citizens that are in special need. Those relationships have helped us to be very effective at our work in the community. More to come. A little bit about our legal authority. On the left is a kind of a bar that shows the types of laws that might affect code enforcement activity. The red being federal laws of the constitutional requirements that we have to be sensitized to. First and Fourth Amendment are primarily concerns, the issues of free speech and the protection against unreasonable search come into play here. But any of the other federal standards that are highly restrictive are those that we're trained in, and we meet quite often to make sure that we don't breach any of those requirements. Above that are the state codes or laws that are put in place specifically for us, the Virginia Uniform Statewide Building Code and the Virginia Maintenance Code. I'll explain a little bit about that. And this authority is actually for us highlighted in orange. The Virginia Maintenance Code is a subsection of the statewide building code. Once a building receives a certificate of occupancy, the maintenance code is the code that is used to continue that legal and safe occupancy of the building. One of the most important activities we do in code enforcement is ensure that safe occupancies are continued. The local ordinances that may be adopted by this board, once empowered through Dillon Rule, involve these 5 ordinances that you see in orange here. The Condition of Private Property Ordinance, which is in part Chapter 10 of the Arlington County Code, deals with public nuisances like grass, trash, overgrowth, vehicles, other types of nuisances that would be addressed in the community. The Noise Control Ordinance, which was adopted in 2014, which we revamped in 2014 when it was initially adopted in the 70s. We spent quite a bit of time working through that ordinance, and there's some additional information we'll pass on about that as we move on. The Sidewalk Snow Removal Ordinance, which was adopted in 2010 following Snowmageddon. The Blight Ordinance, which deals with problem properties. It's a spot blighting tool to address spot blighting influences in the community, adopted in 2003. Building standards, which actually deal with the authority by which we do maintenance inspections. The state enables us to have a maintenance ordinance locally, and when the county adopted it, it was actually planted in the building maintenance standards, or in the building standards, which deals with a number of different things related to housing and housing-related enforcement. We, in 2007, realigned enforcement activities and separated the responsibilities for zoning enforcement out of the unit. If you think about the alignment of it, the zoning enforcement group, which is a very specialized group of inspection staff focusing on use, would actually report to the zoning administrator, and any appeals or actions for relief would actually go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, different than the building code or maintenance code violations that might be addressed by our staff, which would go to a local Board of Building Appeals and then to the State Virginia Technical Review Board for relief. So there is an appropriate alignment to pull out a number of inspectors and focus on the specialized work of zoning. And this has been something that has worked very well. They've been reporting to Arlo Vivon, the zoning administrator, on these specific issues you see now. The site-specific ordinances, such as those that come before the board relative to variances, use permits, and site plan conditions. There's a high level of interest in the community as those ordinances are grafted and drafted. And there's a lot of input by the community and concern about the enforcement of those issues. A little different than some of the weightier issues that might be coming from the state-adopted ordinances like the state adopted codes like the maintenance code or the building code. The zoning ordinance is, again, another big ordinance that is given by state authority that would allow for the enforcement of those land use standards throughout the county.
We had one clarifying
Just a quick
question.
clarifying question. I'm just trying to understand the distinction between code enforcement and zoning enforcement. And you mentioned that zoning enforcement focuses on use. So is it right to, that be roughly the correct breakdown, sort of use versus form? Some challenge with the form of the building or?
Yeah, well, we would focus on, code enforcement would focus on the building, the structure,
Okay.
and the land that's around it.
Got it.
Okay, and it probably would clear it up. You're right.
Slide is a whole explanation.
Let's see if this helps. I was on my way there. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Okay, just walking through, although we work closely, there are some differences, so let's look at what they are. Code enforcement focuses on structures and conditions of property. Zoning is land use concerns. The appeal that I just mentioned and how we appeal is mentioned in the next line. You can see that the code enforcement activities would focus on building safety, and the zoning activities would focus on some of the building uses or the restrictions that are associated with that. Information about how we differ: the average code enforcement case from the time we identify a violation to the average time we close it is about 47 days. As reported by zoning, the average closure on a case is 33 days. Notices are issued upon verification of a violation, okay? Verbal warnings are issued with zoning, and then those issues are documented. The criminal and then civil process is the path that we choose for code enforcement cases. State law would empower us to deal with these issues in a way of a criminal misdemeanor with some civil remedies that are in place, whereas zoning's focus is more civil that can turn to criminal. For example, if they issue civil infractions, when those numbers reach up to $5,000, then they're empowered to proceed as a criminal activity or as a criminal action in the court. The proofs are significant, and this is important, especially when constituents say, hey, I've got some pictures I'd like to give to you to build your case. Our proofs are beyond a reasonable doubt. So the rules of evidence apply very, very strongly in our case. We have to acquire the information. We must witness the violation. When it's complied, we must witness that it is complied and corrected. Whereas the zoning cases, because they're civil in nature, can work on the preponderance of the evidence, the weight of the evidence. Search warrants are required in both cases, which goes back to those federal standards and the protections that would be in place to make sure that there is no unreasonable searches that would take place. A little bit about our workload. There's been some misnomer that we're a bit of a complaint agency, and I wanted to illustrate some of the activity. This is just the enforcement workload for code enforcement, and we're showing the numbers, as you can see in the bar graph, from the years 2013 to 2016, and we average somewhere around 3,000 cases a year. But it's important to note, as you can see in this bar graph in the orange, that the complaints, which are highlighted, hover somewhere around 23% of our workload, around 600 cases a year. So where there have been some concerns in the community, it's needed to note here that mostly our cases are proactively acquired. And when I say proactively, that means that the work is either programmed or periodic. From an earlier slide, there was an elevator program that was in place, and one of the important issues with the elevator inspection program is that that work is periodic as a pushpin. The work is, when you get in an elevator and you see a certificate in place, that certificate says that that equipment is safe to use. That cyclical inspection is periodic inspection. It's not generated by complaint. The surveys that we do of the community to make sure that the service that we're providing throughout the county is equitable is actually programmed. Again, it's not driven by a complaint. But to see the changes in the workload, anything that's in the blue bar is proactive, programmed, or periodic in nature. The complaints are listed below that. There's been some concern about unsafe properties in the community. We've heard a lot of information relative to that. And Chapter 36105C of the Code of Virginia empowers our staff to monitor existing buildings for compliance with code, under which it was approved and certified for occupancy. So there's been this misconception that there's a significant amount of unsafe properties in the county. However, a recent inventory by staff, with the exception of the 200-plus properties that are being sold or transferred that may be vacant for a period of time, show that there are about 81 unsafe properties. That will be at our hands, properties that have become vacated because of, let's say, hoarding conditions or because of some fire or some other instance that caused the building not to be in an occupiable state. Staff are managing those cases actively through. But 81 properties sounds like a lot until you begin to consider the number of developed parcels that we have here in the county at 63,000, and out of 66,000 total parcels. So out of the total parcels that we're dealing with, you're dealing with a very small amount of properties that we're managing through. And that's actually a very fluid amount because those properties will come online and fall online almost daily. A little bit about how we work. As you can imagine, if we're dealing with things like the building code and the maintenance code and standards that change, what's a little confusing to some is that the building code has a tendency to change, sometimes significantly in 3-year cycles. Our staff are involved in code enforcement development, or in the code development, will go to hearings to make sure that whatever might be adopted either in an international settings or down in Richmond at the state level, technical amendments that the state may add, won't be something that we can't live with here in Arlington. The intensive service training that's required in codes is part of it's built into the schedule of work that staff have to do. They spend 5% of their work week in training, in service training and in team meetings, trying to improve the service and align our protocols so that we can ensure that what we're doing is a legal and an authorized and a fair and equitable process. Certainly as it relates to enforcement protocols, we're meeting with the Commonwealth attorney often on our cases and with the county attorney on a biweekly basis. Enforcement, importantly, is comprehensive. That means that when we go to a property, we're addressing the codes that are within our purview. It's not a myopic view. If we're going to look at something that's a very small, minor thing, and we see a bigger, major issue that needs to be addressed, we'll address it at the time so that a property owner receives a comprehensive list of things that need to be corrected. The importance of that is if we don't do it that way, and we have to go back to the property to address something significant, the property owner might feel that that's retaliatory or that's a piling on. So by addressing what we can see as completely as we can the very first time, that gives an opportunity for a property owner to plan out a plan of compliance, how they'd get there. It's a legal process, so we're bound by the due process of law that would make sure that we're following through, we're providing service. The notices are going to the correct parties. If it's a corporation, it's served the way a corporation should be served. If it's a trust, it's served the way a trust should be served. The notices typically go to the property owner with some exceptions. Staff are informative, respectful, equitable, and this is the part that some may not get right away, firm. Code enforcement has an element that deals with enforcement. No one likes the enforcement component, but it's required in order to pull people into compliance. Investigations, as I said earlier, are proactive, periodic, programmed, but in some cases they're triggered by complaints. And complainants, when contacting us, are asked to give information in detail. Well, the best way to reach out to us is by calling us at a number that's existed for over 40 years, 703-228-3232. If you grab an old phone book, you'll actually see it in there, even back when code enforcement was part of the county manager's office. But by calling us, you actually get a dynamic conversation. We don't reveal names. So if someone is concerned that by asking who you are, we're trying to get information, we're actually trying to make sure that if the inspector needs additional information to quickly close the case, they'll be able to reach out and touch and get that information so that compliance is timely. It's not been a case in the 16 years that I've been here ever where we have revealed names or where the court has ordered that names would need to be revealed. Enforcement, a separate action from notice, is actually triggered by failure to comply with a written notice that we send or issue to an owner. Our focus, again, is on safe occupancies. That's really important for us. A little bit quickly about the investigation process. Other than being triggered by a complaint, an investigation is research into the case. We're looking at the records to figure out what has happened at the property. We'll then go to the property and do an inspection, and we'll attempt to validate the conditions that we have found as a violation or not. We'll provide notice, written notice. It's always written notice from the code enforcement group. And in that notice, it gives you some information about the property, why we were there conducting an inspection, what rights you have as an owner or a recipient of a violation notice. And some of them are important, like the right to an extension. If you need more time and you can substantiate the need, there's a process by which you can submit that request to us, and we'll consider it. The need to have an appeal. If you feel like the code is being misapplied, it doesn't apply, I've read it, I've reviewed it, you have the right to have that heard by the appropriate board so that we are presenting our case and you're presenting your case so that that item can be decided. At the state level, it's the state building code, local building code board of appeals, which leads to the technical review board, which then can lead to the circuit court. There's a path of action. Even if there's disagreement, there's a path of action. It's important to note that every notice has got that information and the time by which persons should apply or should file their appeal. We then wait for compliance. We give typically 30 days to comply. Again, you can sometimes get more if you can substantiate the need. And a reinspection is conducted to check to see if the conditions cited have been corrected. So again, to see the condition, to write the condition, we have to see, witness it. To comply, we must see it, witness it. So it's important that property owners call us back so that we can actually see that the conditions are corrected. Otherwise, we couldn't possibly know. Out of that comes either compliance or enforcement. Enforcement is highlighted on the block below, and it includes three primary tools. One is court summons, which we use most often. On the criminal cases, on the cases that we can address as criminal misdemeanors, we'll then summons the property owner to court. And we're then working with the Commonwealth attorney in order to build the case, take the case forward. There's a review by supervisors to make sure the service was appropriate. If there are any defects in the case at all, it went to the wrong person, name spelled wrong, we fix or cure those defects in the violation and go back to the point where there were no defects. Resetting, sitting everything out again new, giving additional time if it's necessary, giving additional notice if it's necessary to make sure that that due process is preserved. In some cases, we have the ability to cure the violation, and a local ordinance like the condition of private property ordinance gives us the ability to go back and cure the violation or to provide a civil infraction. One of the benefits of curing the violation is we'll correct it, the property owner will receive a bill from our administrative staff, and then after 15 days, that bill is then forwarded to a collections so that those issues can be collected and processed. All along the way, documents are issued by certified mail to make sure that it is either gone to someone or it's been signed by someone, or we can prove our attempts at service. Lastly, are civil infractions, which are given to us for things like the snow ordinance or the condition of private property ordinance, which allow us to provide a small fine. It's a warning, and then after 10 days, there's a $100 fine, and then after 10 days, there's a $150 fine for condition of private property. That leads to a $3,000 maximum. Important to note that the two cures that actually get to compliance are the court summons and the cure violation.
I was just saying the sun helps there, doesn't it? The
It
weather.
does. It does. A little bit about what we do. If there are two initiatives that are important, the Safe Occupancies Initiative and the Customer Service Initiatives are it. I just want to highlight a couple of different things. This information has gotten around the community. Years ago, one of the things that would happen one of the issues that would happen after a fire is that a building might sit for a period of time before the conditions got corrected, I'm sorry. So what happens now is when the fire department takes control of a building during exigent events, the building, if it's an existing structure, is turned over to inspection services, code enforcement often if it's an existing structure. And we're communicating with the building owner about what would be needed to get that building back online. And that's been something that has reduced the number of complaints that have come into our office about vacant buildings that have been sitting in the community for some period of time. And there's a misnomer that we're going out to properties and we're just putting people in violation right after they had a fire, which isn't true at all. What we're doing is we're making sure that they understand what the path to correction is. We can expedite some things so that they can get online quicker. But what we found is that when you're dealing with an insurance company right after you've had a fire, it can be a bit overwhelming. So by giving someone a notice that says that the structure that you live in has some corrections that need to be made that are so serious that you can't live in the building, then that notice can be used to help arouse or to direct someone to immediate housing. It has helped the insurance agencies to be able to understand the seriousness of it. Some corporate office out of state all of a sudden says that there's an unsafe condition that's occurring at one of their insured's home. We are willing to have dialogue with the permission of the homeowner to get those buildings online. And working with the chief building official, that's been something that's been very effective in the community. The thank yous are kind of quiet. You know, I think sometimes there's a concern when people will see it's in the community and they think that, well, code enforcement is going to place me in violation. Well, no, it's not that. What we're trying to do is get you back online. We want to make sure that you're safe living in the building. The largest growing or largest trending work that we have right now, actually regionally, the largest amount of work in this industry related to code enforcement, it's unpermitted construction and illegal conversions of use. It's epidemic right now, specifically in this area. Great schools, a wonderful place to live, low crime, people want to be here. So what we've seen is an increase in conversions of attics and garages and spaces and offices into spaces that might be used for other purposes by which they're not approved. The sad effect is that if there's a fire in those buildings, then often there can be an injury, significant, or loss of life because they're not approved to be used that way. The construction methods are not designed, that they've used, are not designed to protect the fire from spreading quickly. So we've been dealing with that. We worked with a number of other counties here. I'm a member of a Northern Virginia code officials consortium, and we meet actually in 2 weeks in Loudoun County to discuss the impact of this. Other cities that have home rule are using different tools to try and get to finding people that they catch doing this work in a significant way. New York City, for example, what we've been doing is we've been working to try and make sure that we get a homeowner that might have inadvertently done something. I did it. I didn't think it was an issue where I lived before. I want to get online. I'll help you to get it to move the property to a compliant property if we can. And if not, we'll then be able to explain the reasons why. Hoarding Task Force. And it's interesting as we talk about numbers. Arlington County since 2003 has done 487 hoarding cases. 487, from severe, which is you can't move through the building, to some that may be moderate. We don't really deal, it's not a housekeeping issue at all. The minor, someone has a room that's filled with storage, is probably not what we see more often. You can't look at a building and tell from the outside the impact of someone that may be living. It's much worse than you see on television. And people are surprised when we bump into the circumstances in a community such as ours. But the ratio for hoarding cases, just nationally, is 390 for every 100,000 population. If we just use that stat, you can imagine we're over 700 cases that are hidden throughout the community. People that may be colleagues and friends of yours that you're not aware of, and they're living in horrific conditions. They can't get to the window, they can't get to the door. We've had people climbing through back doors to get in, climbing through windows. The accumulation is so extensive that it's just inches below a ceiling fan. It can fall on them. The greatest danger is to our first responders that are going in to get them. There's an accumulation or an excessive amount of storage that builds the flame load or the fire load within the unit, and then it makes it so that it's completely unsafe should they go in, and materials that are combustible can potentially light and fall. As an aside, I can remember a case that occurred recently where there's so much accumulation that as we were cleaning it, working with the property owner to clean the property, an extension cord was moved because they can't get to the receptacles. So what they do is they run extension cords through the flammable material and then plug it in. And we can see how the extension cord had scorched against the wall. It was an accident waiting to happen. Our timing was critical. We worked very closely with the fire department, with the Arlington County Police Department, with Human Services. There's a high level of recurrence in these cases. It's very, very complex, but we've been doing very well at this. As it relates briefly to our customer service initiatives, I focus on our service and compliance expectations that we share. When you file a case with code enforcement, certainly by calling us, what you're going to get at the end of that call is a case number, and you're going to get an expectation as to when staff will get there, service expectation, and if we find a violation, what the compliance expectation would be. We've already talked about extensions of compliance and appeals, but also we have our Clean and Lean initiative that I touched on earlier. It's again part of the self-help that we would be able to do under the local condition of private property ordinance. As much as we do some work, there are some things that we don't do. We don't handle tenant-landlord issues. We have a separate division for that. Waste and pickup issues, it's not quite us. The live entertainment and dance hall permits, zoning handles those issues. Water on sidewalks, there's a number of issues. And it's important to note here that 50% of the people that call us are calling with a non-related code enforcement call. It's not related, not sure if this is the right place, but. And so what we've got is somebody that, I'll just start with you. The other interesting stat that I'd like to share with you is that 1/3 of those callers that we receive, calls, documents, emails, faxes, are someone who's already angry. And it's challenging because we have to try and walk them down so that we can triage, we can hear the issues. Importantly, when we finally get down to the issues, we're discovering that the reason why they're probably angry is because they've put off the call, waiting for the person or persons or businesses that were doing something that they did not feel was effective to kind of move on and correct it themselves. Let's see if we can move on a little bit. Some of the challenges to our work, and the biggest challenge is people that wish to bypass the process. Code enforcement is a process. So there's a notice portion, there's certainly an investigation, there's a notice portion, there's a compliance process, there's a reinspection process, there's an enforcement process that can come out of that reinspection. And no one likes the enforcement process. We've seen spikes over the years with retaliatory complaints. Back in the 2000s, early 2000s, they were fairly high. I don't like my neighbors, so what I do is I call the building police, the property police, and I cite conditions and I push really hard to make sure that you deal with them. I want to know what's going on at the property. The opposite side of that is that things have quieted down over time. Our response in training to staff is start to talk about issues of mediation. If you're not getting along with your neighbor, there are tools. That community mediation is very effective. And it's not court. You don't have to go to court to resolve it. But if the issue is that something that needs to be addressed by us, we're certainly going to address that. Anonymous complaints, persons that are at glass houses throwing rocks, and sometimes they're giving us inappropriate addresses. Just drive out to the community and you'll see what I'm talking about. And unfortunately, if you're anonymous, we may not know that it's you that have a greater violation than the person you're calling about. That's happened. That's an unintended consequence. So we like to get information about who's calling, and the benefit of that is if the inspectors need additional information, for example, an overcrowding case, Someone believes that there are too many people living in the house. Overcrowding, actually, under the zoning definition, would be over-occupancy, maybe too many unrelated people living in the house. What's helpful is if those calls come in, and they often do come into code enforcement, we're able to get the information, build the case, and then send it to the zoning enforcement group so that they've got good, sound information to do their investigation. If they just knock on the door and say, hey, are you overcrowding over here? Somebody that might be doing it would just go underground. So the more information we're able to get in a dynamic way, in a conversation, the more effective we can be in our enforcement, the quicker that timeline to compliance will occur if there is indeed a violation. It's actually very rare for someone to be able to have too many people in a building based on the square footage of the home, which is what we deal with under the building code. Big issue here is aggressive citizens, case filings that are based in racism, bigotry, or standing. The calls are sometimes very direct. We have to deal with all citizens. That's anyone who will call us at any time with any issue. And depending on their level of anger or concern, sometimes they're very direct about what their position is. I don't have to go deep into the details of what you can probably imagine in your mind, but people will speak very, very directly and then say what they don't like about that group, those people, that business, whatever the case is, and they're bordering right on the line, actually easily defined. There's a definition of discrimination, racism, and what we're trying to do is make sure that our staff focus on the building and focus on the issues around the land. And we'll communicate that. And we'll communicate that expectation. Sometimes even after a complete investigation, if we find that there is no violation, there's an additional agenda. I want to know why there was no violation. Well, what about, and the list gets longer. And what about, and the list gets even longer. So we can sometimes work those persons that are driving those issues down. But sometimes those issues bubble up to your level in the form of a complaint about arbitrary enforcement or our ability not to bring something to closure. I've already spoken about the non-related calls that have come into the agency and those that might be contentious to us. Let's see if I can get to the concerns here. So some of the chief concerns that have been reported to us relate to hoarding or unsafe properties, derelict properties that are in the community. There's been a concern about nighttime noise enforcement and how we deal with it. And then cyclical property concerns that are often brought about with seasonal issues that come across. So if the question is, what is a derelict property? And we wanted to define it a little bit and then talk about some of the concerns. So the concerns are properties that are unsafe, that are declared unfit by the maintenance code definitions, buildings that might be vacant, again, excluding those 200 so properties that are in transfer each week, or properties that have stalled compliance. It doesn't seem like the case is moving. Again, if I point out that our compliance on average is 47 days, some are almost complied immediately. Others have taken 4 years to comply. But on average, 47 days is pretty good. Concerns, the timeline is long. It takes a long time to get code enforcement to move forward. If you remember that a third of the people that are contacting us are already angry, and in some cases it's because they waited a long time to call. So we're adding that to the perception in their mind. And when you call us, it's the first time we heard. So it's important for us to tell what that timeline is going to be. That's why the service expectations are so important. There's been a concern about additional laws. Do we need additional laws to be effective at code enforcement? But a real challenge has been complex ownerships, unprobated estates, parents that have died, or trusts that seem to have fizzled. And we try and work through those lines to see if we can get the correct property so that we can do the enforcement that's listed here. Court enforcement is the tool that has worked for us. Go backwards for a moment. In 2003, when we adopted the spot blight ordinance, the key is that we had 117 properties that were on a blight list, and Mr. Fizette may remember it, and the community forwarded those properties to us, and staff added to that list. 3 properties came to the board. 114 properties were cured with old-fashioned court enforcement. We take the property owners to court, and enforce the minimum standards, which help them to bring those buildings back into compliance. What's completely legal is what you see is the center picture here. It's a building that's boarded up. A property owner, the Commonwealth is a huge property rights state, and you can literally board up a building as long as the conditions on the outside meet compliance. And what we had done is to work to make sure that that type of influence, negative influence in the community is really minimized. We try and steer property owners to putting the building back into use. It takes a lot of skill to do that. We want to get the building back online. You can transfer it. Have you considered selling the building? Have you considered putting family members into it? There are places where you can go if you don't believe that you can afford to make the repairs. And we use compliance coaching to help people to get there. The blight ordinance, we've spoken about a little briefly. The blight ordinance has 9 conditions that can be activated to go forward. What will happen is that those properties will receive a preliminary blight designation for me, and it would have to meet one of 9 sets of conditions. And then the property owner, should they fail to cure the blight, that would come forward to the Planning Commission and then to this board, where you can make a decision to cure the blight, take care of the issue, which may be to take care of some problem that's creating it, or take the building down, or to acquire the property. It's a lengthy process. It's an expensive process. It works very much like eminent domain. It can take as much as a year to pull all the way through. When I say expensive, to take a simple property like the one down, based on figures that we've received, would be about $70,000. So if we've got 81 properties that we're attempting to deal with, you could see what the math would be like if we decided to go forward with that. Nighttime noise. Andy Penn is here from, Deputy Chief Andy Penn is here to answer some questions in depth about noise concerns. I did want to say what the issue is that happens at noise. There's confusion about who to call, and we've worked through that when we worked through the 5-year-long process for the noise ordinance. The other is managing citizen expectations. It's about a 2009 Virginia Supreme Court decision to remove subjectivity. Well, we were very effective at removing it from the ordinance, not so much from the minds of citizens. You know, too loud is still too loud to me. Wrong music is still the wrong music. Turn it down. The biggest problems that are reported to us are construction activity at night and barking dogs. But that's not the biggest activity that's reported to the Arlington County, noise-related activity that's reported to the Arlington County Police, as you can probably imagine. Probably stems around the issues or activities of parties and revelers, music that's too loud, fighting, public drunkenness. Those have been the activities, and I'll let Deputy Chief Penn go into detail when we get to discussion. Importantly, we've spoken about coordinating between our agencies and the protocols that we put in place. So we have an enterprise-wide database system that we're attempting to adopt and put in place here that would allow us to communicate a warning that occurs during the day with an enforcement action that might occur at night. So one of the challenges is with the noise ordinance, there's a requirement to warn first. So you can imagine when the police show up in their uniform, with their officialness, a warning from them usually kind of quells whatever the sound issue is. There may be a high level of criminality that's going on that they're going to address, but what it's going to do is kind of put a lid on the noise. With us, sometimes there are some levels of recurrence. The pre-construction meetings will take care of some of the issues around construction activities. Mostly what we're getting are calls around the big projects, not something, and there's a misnomer that you can't do construction activity, and it's the noise ordinance is the reason why. It's not true. The noise ordinance does not regulate construction activity. The noise ordinance regulates noise. So a site plan or use permit condition may restrict a property owner from staging or from doing certain types of activity, even if the noise ordinance would allow you to create noise for that type of activity as you're building. That goes back to the site-specific ordinances that zoning has purview that you adopt as a board here. There's something new that we've looked at, and after discussion with the chief building official, he has the ability to issue a stop work order for violations of pertinent laws. such as the noise control ordinance. So if we place someone, either the police or if code enforcement places some property owner in violation because of construction-related noise that's being produced, that information to him could produce a stop work order for them to stop work, which is significant, until they're able to comply with the noise ordinance.
Good lever.
See if I can move on here.
That's a good one.
And cyclical property issues. This is often built around the issues of, this is where we hear mostly the concerns of arbitrary enforcement. These are standards that actually are international property maintenance code, which is part of the International Code Council, puts the same standards in place that we have here. And we've heard about arbitrary enforcement. We've heard about inadequate enforcement, the other side of the spectrum. There's been some challenges about county methods that we use to correct violations, and what they're talking about is the cure. And we do a small amount. It actually wound up in the budget. We're dealing with 15, 16, 18 cases on average a year. County enforcement of encroaching or overgrown vegetation on, and this is something that's been specified to you, butterfly gardens and certified wildlife habitats. What we've seen, even when we respond to these issues, is 6 feet of vegetation that prohibits anyone from the street to see the structure. What we've seen and what we've received is complaints about vermin, vector-related issues, biting insects, ticks in the community, and that's what the vegetation limitations are designed to cure. This is not at all about cultivated gardens, but this is about letting things grow wild and out of control. This is a very, very dense community. There are expectations in the community that people are expected to adhere to. Education is the most important piece. So we try and explain the reasons why. And we've actually put that information on our Building Arlington website. We want people to go there and visit it, see and hear why those conditions are in place. But they're not unusual for Arlington. And this is part of enabling legislation that was put in place in the 80s and have been adopted by most counties, larger counties initially, then expanded by the state to be something that can be of performance in all counties. There's also been an assessment of unused personal items that are stored outside as trash and debris. The condition of private property ordinance kind of gives us some path to say when the personal items could become a harborage or potential issue that would affect the safety of others. Again, tires and things that are stored on the outside, containers, wood that might be contributing to pests that might be invading other properties. So the cyclical property concerns are vegetation overgrowth and items that are openly stored. The way we deal with it are through civil infractions, which could be the fines that I pointed out earlier. Warning, 10 days, $100, 10 days, $150, excuse me, or self-help protocol, which is to cure the violation and give the property owner that cost. And in closing, safe occupancies are our primary focus, importantly. Proactive, periodic, or programmed work is how we are driven. Our inspections are comprehensive. They're a legal process. And because they're a legal process, they're triggered when there is failure to comply with a written notice, always that. The staff training is extensive. In order to be able to do this effectively, there are very few cases where we have had to withdraw a violation notice because of a defect. But we are willing to withdraw a violation notice if it is defective, because we wouldn't be able to prosecute it or to take it to an appeal. If we know that it's wrong, we're going to fix it and pull it back. Importantly, staff are informative, education is key, respectful, equitable, and firm. I want to thank you for the opportunity to address some of the concerns that you have, and I'm certainly here with Arlo Vavon and Shariar Mary and Andy Penn and the manager to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. That was just about, I think, what we wanted. Is about half the time for the background and teeing up, I'm sure, some questions. I'm going to take the prerogative to ask one, and then I'm going to go around the room and the board, and I'd ask you to each ask one and then move on, and then we'll circle back. I'm sure we'll go through several times, but so everyone has a chance. So let me start with mine, and that's toward the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned that nobody's name is revealed, that it's anonymous. How does that relate to the FOIA laws? And if somebody registered a complaint through the board office that got to you?
We redact the names, that any FOIA that would be processed by code enforcement is reviewed by the county attorney's office before it's forwarded on.
And so by standard practice, the name of the complainant does not reach somebody who submits a FOIA request?
We're not, yes. The answer to that would be yes. The name of the complainant is not revealed.
Okay. Okay, fine. Let's go to Katie and then circle over to Christian and then John.
Yeah, so, thank you. You described,
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot Libby. She'll be in there too.
you described the cyclical property concerns, which I do think constitutes the bulk of what we hear, at least at the board. So I wanted to just make sure I'm tracking this. So they're called cyclical properties. Is that because these violations come to light because of cyclical inspections?
No, actually, they're seasonal issues,
okay.
mostly. So, yeah, grass grows. And the encroaching vegetation issues that we're going to see are going to be usually someone that steps away from it. There is some level of recurrence.
Okay.
We will know those properties that year after year need a nudge to come into compliance. So when we're dealing with proactive, our community surveys, the inspectors will drive by to make sure it's not getting out of hand. We don't want to wait until it gets 6 feet tall to address it, when the limit is 12 inches. When the limit is 12 inches.
So that actually gets to the heart of what I wanted to ask, which is appreciated the kind of review of what proactive enforcement looks like for code enforcement, right? The periodic and programmed workload. So what I was trying to get a beat on is what elements of the programmed or cyclical inspections would be germane to individual residences, so non-commercial, right? We can all understand that you would periodically inspect elevators, but when and under what conditions can people expect to see code enforcement in their neighborhood if they haven't been called? And I just heard you say community surveys, sort of time to seasonal. Are there other conditions under which?
There are. Thank you. And some of them include the common area inspections on multiple buildings, multiple dwellings. We've begun a process to do the inspections on some of the aging site plans that we have in the county, that once approved. The addition would be, that probably would help to look at my notes. That would be cyclical inspections. So I might have gone too far. Here we go. The 360-degree compliance review, which is important. That's, again, if we're going to your property to address an issue, a gutter fell. So the issue would be, do we see within plain view any other issues that would relate to the maintenance code, the gutters falling, broken windows, chimney bricks that have fallen off, those issues that we can address. And what it's helped us to do is to take care of the whatabouts that we'll get as we talk to you as a property owner and you receive a notice. The next thing is, well, what about over there? And what about behind me I saw? And it's helpful if we can speak with our constituents and say, thanks, we've already got that case and we're dealing with it. It helps to build confidence. And in a lot of communities, it's been an expectation that we're going to take care of it. It's great when we receive a call and then someone hears that we've already got a case on that and we're working it through. It builds confidence in the program.
Let's go to Christian, John, and then Libby.
I got to be judicious here with my one. I do have a follow-up to that one, but I think I just want to broach a new area for now and maybe follow up with that a little bit later. So within the world of compliance, it's more of an adversarial, it's a stick approach. You are using the various forms at your disposal to get people to correct a violation. Are there any carrots that we use as part of trying to achieve compliance as an outcome, recognizing that on a base level we're trying to correct defects, but in terms of encouraging outcomes, do we have any kind of carrot approaches that we employ, have ever thought about employing to make sure that this is a little bit more outcome-based?
I think that's a great question, and importantly, I want to say around 2006, we realized that, again, if a third of the calls that we're receiving is someone that's angry, that's someone who's calling in about an issue. If we look at the fact that most people have absolutely no idea what we do, and education is key, that you could see the lights go off as you're talking to them. Oh, I didn't know. I didn't realize I came from someplace else, and they don't do that there. So the education is so key. We've written a number of articles for the Citizen magazine. We introduced in 2006 extensive community outreach where we're at civic associations. Now, some civic associations don't meet, and we've been able to communicate with their leads about concerns. For example, when a porch failed in Dominion Hills, it made the newspaper, it made the local blogs. We set up to go out. We did a presentation to illustrate what happened. The big concern in that community was, well, will my porch fail in such a way? My home is built around the same time. And that was a way for us to get out into the community and tell the story about what they should be doing to maintain their structure. We've done education about persons that have no idea how to select a contractor. If I happen to be a senior that lives in a property and I can't do this work myself anymore, I need somebody to kind of walk me through the process. So we can do that one-on-one. It's interesting to point out when we've gone to commissions, for example, like the Housing Commission or Tenant Landlord Commission to speak, there was a bit of a misnomer that our rental property was the worst of our housing stock in the portfolio. It's not. It's actually condominiums that are seeing the larger offense of deferred maintenance. I don't want to see my assessment go up. So what we do is we put that off. It's such a serious thing that we started trying to make sure that they understand that deferring maintenance is not a cure. You want to make sure that you get out there and take care of these issues before they become extremely costly and then begin to affect your ability to stay in the home. So proactive communication, hitting boards of engagement, getting to the citizens has been key. Asking to go rather than being summoned. That's so huge. The conversation is completely different if I'm summoned to a civic association meeting. It's pointed. If I'm there and I come, and I say, hey, I'd like to share something with you about what's happening in your community, trends. A new database that we're anticipating would allow us to more effectively report trends that are happening in your civic association versus another. We're really excited about the anticipation of that coming online. I hope that begins to answer some of what your concerns were.
It does, and I may have some ideas that I offer as we get into further discussion, but I don't want to take more time than is allotted.
John?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I do have several questions, but I'll be mindful of the one per shot rule. Mr. Green, this has really been helpful, and I appreciated the crispness and organization of your slides. So I think it was on either slide 5, 6, or 7. Maybe, can we try slide 7? And my particular focus is blighted properties. Blighted properties can not only be attractive nuisances for vagrants and so forth, but they can also depress neighborhood property values. And as you know, I've brought a number of those. I've asked you about a number of properties that I've just witnessed, going around different neighborhoods, some of which were logged into the system and you have enforcement action with respect to, and maybe a few others that you don't. So that's slide 7. Let's go back to slide 6 or 5.
Mr. Vice Chair, I think it's further on.
Further on. Okay, so what my question is, you have there was an asterisk in the upper right-hand corner of one of the slides, kind of right in here, where you indicated that there might be the need for additional laws. So my question really is, do you feel, with respect to blighted properties, that we're fully leveraging and taking advantage of all current enforcement opportunities that we have? Are there others that we maybe have that you think that we have the authority for that we haven't explored? And then finally, might we need to go to Richmond for further tools? And while it might be uphill, might it be a battle worth fighting to combat what we view, at least in our community, as a blighted property.
Okay, so it's actually on, it's slide 16, yes.
Yeah.
So in relation to the blighted properties, what I wanted to do initially was to give perspective about the properties that we believe might approach blight based on the conditions that the blight ordinance defines. And it would be actually a little less than the 81 that are there. The properties are active cases that are being worked through. So the question that's listed on slide 16 is a common question that has come to us about whether or not we need additional laws. And I looked at this very carefully. I think as a person that's been doing this in my 31st year, I've just passed my 31st year, I'm going to my 32nd year of doing this. I think we've got the right tools. I think it's about indulging patience as we work through it. We have a tool, both Mr. Amiri and I, through the Virginia Building Code and Officials Association, to be able to ask their lobbyists about the likelihood of being able to get something forward into the building code. If it's about moving an issue through the building code to go forward, if I can get consensus on that, it's likely in a deal and rule environment to be very successful. And there's been some times when we've gone to our hearings and we've had discussions about what we need, and I don't want to say it in an offensive way, but my colleagues mid and east parts of the states will say the great state of Northern Virginia versus the Commonwealth.
Sure.
There may not be consensus about the issues when we take it to a broader group. So if it's about new laws, I would wonder what the new law would do if I've got a couple of tools and we haven't exhausted them yet. I think it's time to add an additional tool. The blight ordinance was really about that. It's an additional tool. If nothing else works, you have this way that you can acquire the property or you can cure the issue. And some communities use that more than we do because they're not as effective in the court process. So, and compliance doesn't move as quickly. So to the stats, let me give this to you. We take less than 2% of our cases to court for enforcement. That's important, less than 2%. Most property owners comply during the period of voluntary compliance. That's important because if we go to the enforcement that we saw when I outlined the inspection process, one would think that because of how big the process is, a lot of people fall into that. And it's not true. Most people comply during the 30 days that they need, that they're given to comply, or they choose to extend it and say, look, I can't get this done in that time period. And they submit a request for an extension, substantiating the reason why. We approve it and give them more time. It just extends the voluntary period of compliance. So we haven't found the need. I came here from a jurisdiction in the Midwest where people didn't have the resources to fix properties. And the law was way more stringent than what we have in the Commonwealth. It gave persons criminal records, and they still couldn't fix it. We have the resources here. We have tools. The county has tools that they can use. I think we've got it. I'd be the first one to come to you and say, I need help. We can't get what we need done. I haven't had to ring that bell yet.
So what do you mean by additional laws are needed?
That's a concern that has been brought to us. It's not a concern that I agree with.
Okay. So at least at this time, you feel that we have all the necessary tools at our disposal, and it's just a question of implementing them and working with folks?
We've got a great cadre of tools to work with.
Then why does it seem to be taking so long with respect to certain houses in certain communities where, at least to the naked eye, there appears to have been no change for months or years?
Ownership, making decisions with.
Explain what the ownership means.
Well, the ownership may be gray. The parent died, the children don't get along, and what we're trying to do is, and my staff have worked to try and get those persons together, bring them into a sequester room on my floor, have them sit down and have a conversation about getting on the same page, opening up a probate estate, and going forward so that the issues can be closed. It's not just hanging out there. That's a very, very difficult thing to work through. And there's a reason why. We've talked to people who have claimed to be a neighbor and actually are relatives associated with the property, making muddy our case. So there's a reason why we lock down our investigation so we don't put too much information out there, because I may be talking to someone who is indirectly related to the action that we're trying to take. We've seen that. It's very, very difficult to get compliance if you don't know who to serve. It would be difficult even with blight to go forward if we're fighting to try and figure out, well, who exactly should we be dealing with on that?
All right, thank you. Let's go on to Libby. Do you have a question for staff?
I do. Thank you very much. And I first want to thank Mr. Green. I think here, I'm sorry I can't be in the room with you because I didn't get to see all of the inspectors together for the one and only time. And thank you for all the good work that everybody does. I think I want to follow up. My question is really a bit of a follow-up on several of them. I think I'll focus on the encroaching vegetation issue that we've seen from time to time. And I noticed one where it seemed that our rule regulations on the encroaching vegetation were not maybe reasonable for that particular setting. And do you think while you've got the tools you need, should there be more flexibility in the tools? And I could see this even on a state level. So what makes sense in southwestern rural Virginia does not make sense here in Arlington and vice versa. And maybe in some of our very our neighborhoods that that don't get a lot of traffic, the rules that apply to those neighborhoods maybe don't make quite as much sense as the ones that apply to somebody who's on Glebe Road or Wilson Boulevard. Does that make sense?
Well, what I'm hearing is a dog.
Yes, you are. You are, and I'm going to mute it.
See if we can get someone to go over to Madam Garvey's property, a barking dog. The noise ordinance, we're not talking about vegetation. The condition of private property is a local ordinance, and it's not treated like a site-specific ordinance. It's actually county-wide. So while I appreciate, and we've heard this as a concern about, well, in this community, we would like this. In this community, we would like that. But the application of the county-wide ordinances in a site-specific way really approaches, a level of danger, because as the constituency changes, there's going to be a need to change further. Could
I follow up a little?
Yes.
I understand with encroaching vegetation, in some cases, it's sightline for driving, and you want people to be safe. I'm assuming that's one of the major issues we're concerned about with that, or being able to walk on a sidewalk.
Well, the sight lines is actually a zoning violation, and Arlova Vaughn, if you...
Hi.
Excuse me?
This is Arlova.
Hi, Arlova, how are you?
Okay. I think that particular instance you're talking about is what we call a vision triangle at corners of intersections, and that is a zoning ordinance regulation about visibility and safety in terms of being able to see through your turning radius.
Okay, and I don't know, it seems to me that some places where people are only going to be going about 25 miles an hour, it's not as, you might have a slightly more flexibility than a place where the traffic is going quite a bit faster. And maybe that's not correct, but I worry a little bit that we have sort of the one-size-fits-all when maybe if safety is the issue, perhaps there's traffic speeds or something else that could be put in there to make it a little more flexible and a little more adaptable to different circumstances. But perhaps that's not the way we do things. I'd love some comment.
Currently, there's a difference depending on the district. So residential districts have a different requirement than commercial districts. So at that level, we do take those differences into consideration. But we don't, it's not regulated by the speed limit.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So we do have some difference. That's helpful to know. And then one more, just back to Mr. Green. On the state laws, are there any there where you think that some differences in the, Northern Virginia, the rest of the state that you mentioned, the laws could be maybe a little more adaptable, or are you finding you've got what you need and it's not an issue?
When I meet with my colleagues in Loudoun, Prince William, Alexandria, Fairfax, they're using the same tools, and they're experiencing some of the same issues, but to a lesser degree. I think some of the sensitivities are because of the density that we experience here. We're closer than those properties are in those communities, so the impact might be slightly greater. The irritant level might be slightly higher. You'd like to see it cleared up much quicker. So when I've discussed some of the concerns even that would be coming to this board with some of those colleagues, they're not exactly experiencing those same levels of issues in those communities. But this is a unique community. And so what we want to do is work through and figure out how we can, work through those perceptions. I'm hoping that education will help get us there. But it's important for me to note to this board that 47 days average compliance, which is really what's happening, is really unheard of. So if we have a couple of cases that go 4 years because they're in a legal process, I have no control over the fact that the courts will extend out time or give times. That's literally what can happen. And that's part of due process. And it just is what it is. Sure. But what we want to do is be forthright and then be fair and then try and coerce people to use the tools of compliance and get there. But importantly, in closing this, Ms. Garvey, once people comply, in most cases, we never see them in those circumstances again. Once they go through the process, most people never revisit it. They got an education. Should we cite them for something the next time? They immediately call us, and they're usually taking care of it right away.
Thank you,
Good
Libby.
to know. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I can add something to Ms. Garvey, maybe it will be helpful about what's going on at the state level. Just for the statistical purpose, I think it's important to note that out of the board, really, the cases that we deal with gets elevated to the board level at the rate of 3 for every 1,000 cases we have. So that's a ratio that comes up to the board level in terms of
County board.
County board. The issues that becomes
3 out of
grounds.
every 1,000
3 out of every 1,000. That's our statistic about
citations or
citations and cases that comes in here. So part of the proactive is that education piece of it that Mr. Green talked about, and that's really, that's been great. That's been working very well. Additional legislation, we meet the property maintenance official and the building official in Northern Virginia. We meet on a quarterly basis. So we are not too far away. And I know oftentimes people tell us, hey, have you checked with Fairfax County? Have you checked with Alexandria? Have you checked with other communities? I want to tell you that other communities are the ones that are benchmarking with us, for better or for worse. We're continuously getting inquiries from all over the country about how our property maintenance inspection, how our building department is run, because we happen to be accredited.
Thank you,
Thank
Libby.
you very much. That's helpful. These are impressive numbers. Thanks.
Let me just first say that I think the presentation was really excellent. The way it was laid out, easy to understand and walk through. So thank you for that. I will say that I've probably been making a mistake for many years telling people that we have a complaint-driven system of code enforcement. So in many ways, this was a real education even to me. But I would like to focus on slide 5 for a second, which I think was the main areas, particularly, it doesn't really get to every area, but it's the local ordinances and state ordinances that code enforcement handles. So, Gary, if my mistake was to say we're mostly complaint-driven when your next slide or two really shows it's maybe 25% or less are complaint-driven, I think of things like the snow ordinance, the noise ordinance, and a lot of the vegetation as complaint-driven. I mean, so can you give me a sense of where the bulk of the code enforcement is that's not complaint-driven, and are there still some areas that are? complaint-driven, even though it's only a relatively small portion of the total?
The 360-degree community compliance review, where we're at one property addressing an issue, the property that we may be servicing may be a complaint. The others that we're addressing are not. They're literally being picked up as proactive cases. There's no one complaining about that issue.
So what you just said is when you go to follow a complaint, you may find 2 or 3 or 4 other things. And I know you talked about the proactive and the periodic, the elevators and all that. But what are the areas that are a lot driven by complaints? And again, I'll just expound on it. I have often said we don't want to be a police state walking around everybody's neighborhood looking for the bush hanging over the sidewalk.
So that's a good question. The issues that are driven by complaint will vary, depend on the time of year we're in. Start of the heating season, heat, hot water, apartment buildings, they're gonna reach out to us. Leaves, snow blowers, they're going to reach out to us.
Right.
These are
Noise, that's noise, right?
that's going to be a noise issue. So it's going to mostly have to do with the condition of private property ordinance issues and building code or building maintenance code issues. So air conditioning hit us on May 15th, just slightly between May 1st and May 15th.
Yeah.
Big buildings pay a lot some people are paying a lot in what they feel is rent or housing costs. They want the air conditioning in an older building to be flipped over sooner than the code would require it. That the building owner can turn it on sooner, but they have to maintain heat through a certain period. And those have been complaints that were coming into 6, 7 a day. And so we're explaining what the law is, and there's a remedy around it, but most building owners are not willing to exercise the cost to do that. Occasional issues with water supply in older buildings. Those are the things that are coming. Mostly it's going to be, I see something, it's at the back of a property, and it's going to be the weight of a complaint. Now, mind you, again, we're not getting a lot of complaints. We're talking, if you consider that bar graph, 600 a year. 65 days, that's not given our workload.
Snow and noise tend to be complaint-driven, correct?
Snow and, well, actually, both of those ordinances are designed to be driven by snow. You can't do it any other way. With noise, you need to know what it is you're trying to exclude. What sound source am I listening for? So it needs to be someone talking about a specific noise someplace for us to go address. That's the complaint.
That's the complaint.
Snow is completely complaint-driven, but it's an interagency reporting, and it's not included in the bar graph work that we're doing here. So that would actually be a greater amount. It's a workload for us, but it tends to change. This year was fairly light.
Yeah.
The year before, not so much. But
Okay, I mean, that's helpful. Just talk through a little bit.
Mr.
Katie?
Facet, if I may add one element, and I don't think we really talked about it too much in depth. One of the things we are starting to see, historically I've been here for 11 years, so code enforcement has been part of my division, but I remember 11 years ago everybody looked at code enforcement as a housing inspectors, for lack of a better term. What we are seeing right now is need for maintenance of older commercial buildings. You know, we get a complaint on a balcony, we end up going on a condominium building, and before you know it, 500 balconies need to be repaired because there is an age to the concrete. We see parking structures that were built in 1970s that need. So our work in the future will be shifting from a housing inspector per se to we have a stock of commercial properties that are in need of maintenance. And as Gary mentioned, people think that rental properties are prime issues. They are not. The condominium buildings are, because at the high rental rate, it turns out that they actually fix it because they can get good rental income from it. But so our work focus is starting to shift more towards commercial development.
Interesting. Katie?
So speaking of commercial development and noise, I gotta make sure it's worth Andy's while to have come up here. So I wanted to ask a little bit about, just based on some conversations I've had with constituents who are concerned about nighttime noise and code enforcement, particularly I think with things that they see that might actually be violations of a site plan condition. So even if they are not violations of the noise ordinance, they could potentially be out of compliance with the construction hours that are specified or the loading dock hours that are specified. And so wanted to ask a little bit about the handoff between zoning enforcement and code enforcement, and then ask a little bit about what people can expect in terms of the handoff between when they call the police in the evening, again, particularly with those nighttime noise violations that seem to be about loading, construction, et cetera. You hear people say things like, for example, the police come out, but they say they don't have the detection information or the tools that would allow them to detect sound. So let me ask first, if code enforcement staff receive a call about, there's too much noise from loading or construction, is your staff trained to say, we can send somebody out with a noise detector, but it's also possible that you should look at whether there's site plan conditions? What is the handoff when somebody may not have redress through the noise ordinance, but could potentially through the site plan conditions?
Let's begin at the nighttime. What happens if the police gets called, and if Chief Penn can explain that one. So we can start that, and then we talk about the daytime noise in case that's...
Well, I think that, let me just to sort of put a fine point on it, although I recognize we're not here to talk about individual circumstances, the concern I most often hear is nighttime deliveries, right, or nighttime construction. So that is a little bit what I'm thinking, yeah.
Okay, so just generally, over the last 5 years, we average about 2,649 loud calls a year. So we don't capture construction versus loading dock and all. I mean, that would have to be a hand search, but the vast majority of these, 80%, are closed with nothing found or with no report. And when we drill down a little bit further, like from January of 2015 to the end of May of this year, we had 93 instances where the officer felt strongly enough to write a report or document it somehow. But still, year after year, we find situations in less than a handful where we actually charge somebody with the noise violation. What the officer will do, irregardless of the type of noise, is we'll send an officer to the scene. If it's a loud party, the first time is usually we just ask for compliance. Meet with the homeowner, whoever's in charge, explain what the noise ordinance is, and ask them to turn it down, get everybody inside, shut the windows. And the majority of the time, that resolves it. If we get a second call at this point, it's at the officer's discretion. If the homeowners or the property manager are still cooperative and are trying, they may get a second warning, but there's no expectation of a second warning. That could result in somebody being charged with the noise ordinance and the party being ended at our direction. The third time, it's pretty much over. But like I said, we run into this a handful of times a year where we ever have to actually enforce the noise ordinance.
Can I just ask to follow up, how do you know they've broken it without having something to measure? Or do you have something to measure the noise?
We don't have the noise measuring devices, but if you can hear it, several houses away, more often than not, all I have to do is come knock on your door and I say, we got a call from your neighbors. They're complaining about the party's too loud. Could you get everybody inside and shut the windows? And the most of the time, that resolves the concern.
I heard that. I'm sorry to interrupt. I hear that, but then you said if that doesn't happen and they call again, if they're out of compliance, then ... But you don't know if they're out of compliance, right? Because you don't have a...
For construction noise, we don't, because it has to be a certain decibel level. In the noise ordinance, there's several identified prohibited acts, so many distance from a street or from a place where if I can hear it, it's in and of itself a violation of the noise ordinance. Where that doesn't help us is construction noise. That requires the actual decibel meter, and we don't have that, but we have... it's the same procedure for us. Usually we meet with the foreperson there and be like, we're getting complaints. And normally they want to be a good neighbor. It's not normally an issue, but we've worked together and they've created an email address to where if an officer goes out and it's construction noise or loading dock noise, something that could be followed up by code or building officials during the day, we're going to ask the officers to send an email, describe their observations, what they heard, and during the daytime, staff can follow up with some of the specific remedies that they have access to that we may not. I think that's going to be a key feature in resolving this, is the ability to close that loop. more often than not, we get compliance, but I think it's good to have the follow-up piece where code can follow up and explain the rules, and if need be, come out with us with a noise meter if it goes that far, and then fix it that way.
Ms. Crystal, if I may attempt to answer two of the pieces. When we, Mr. Facet, when we changed the noise ordinance several years ago, it was to take out that necessity for the police officer to go with a meter. I know that was a big discussion back then. Hey, police officers don't want to have a noise. They don't need a noise meter. So we put, with the help of the county attorney and board passed it, we put in tools called prohibited acts that you don't need a noise meter for an officer to do that. In terms of the site plan conditions, this email address is going to be monitored both by the zoning administrator office and by code enforcement. But the most powerful tool, I believe, for the construction activities and noise construction is the tools that I have in my place about violating pertinent laws. You know, a 12-story or 25-story building stops for one day. That's a big deal.
So this is actually, I'm now starting to understand how this will work, and just to clarify, and then I'll yield the floor here. But so, yeah, an individual complains, it's 3 a.m., someone's getting eggs delivered, it's keeping me awake. They are gonna call the police will write it up. You don't have a noise meter, but you will write it up. And then both Shahryar's team and ISD, code enforcement and zoning enforcement will all see that email and say, across the three of us, one of us will probably have the tools to take action.
Can I provide some level of clarity? The delivery of items is usually an activity that will be regulated by zoning, and I know our level of own and Robert Lover here from zoning and can speak to what those site plan conditions might be. But I wanted to add an important note. I think I did it a little earlier, and I said the noise ordinance doesn't regulate construction activity. It doesn't. It regulates the sound. There's lots of construction activity that you can do that produces very little or no noise. Drywall, electrical work, some plumbing work. It produces no work. Glazing. It produces very little work, very little noise at all. Hanging ceiling tiles, you can do lots of activities. It's when it exceeds. And mostly what we've been discovering that may be hitting your board is a big site plan that's going on. And we've told them that the police have the right to shut them down. If they come there and they find that they're doing some activity that's outside of those hours. This is completely different than the work that my office might use to grant an exemption, which is going to be, there's some greater need, and it's a limited thing. That information is published to the civic associations, and it's sent to the police so that they know that there's some limited exemption that we're given for them to conduct some work they can't possibly do at any other time.
Thank you. Let's go to Christian.
So I'd like to get back to the complaint-based part of the metrics. You know, Mr. Facet, I think, you know, even though you've been describing it as complaint-based, perhaps mistakenly in terms of the overall program, it's still very true that complaints drive enforcement activities. And I'd like to just hone in on that a little bit, because I think some of what we feel from people is, you know, someone complained about me, therefore there is this state action being taken against me, and yet I see this happening everywhere else. So I just want some thoughts, and maybe from Mr. Schwartz, about the extent that our bureaucracy is sort of used to sort of litigate, you know, personal disputes among people, or, you know, issues that are really better suited to other realms than the power of the state to sort of enforce things, given that we are not able to take a strategic approach to see that this is applied more broadly. And I'm not necessarily sure that we can't, but we don't. And so if you have any thoughts about that, to what extent we're seeing that we're becoming agents of what should rightly be interpersonal conversations and disputes.
My observations are purely anecdotal at this point, and I know Robert Sharp is with us, our ombudsman, and I think that I'll usually come by his office I walk by his office all the time. I walk by quickly, of course, but have a conversation with him about once a week. And I think that he's characterized that anecdotally, there have been more cases recently of people calling up with complaints that they don't know, there aren't other avenues, or at least they know how to deal with, and they're using this as a let's say a cudgel. What's the word I'm looking for? In a way that and Gary Green referred to it, is that I think there's certainly room, and I've had conversations in the past, there may be room for more of a mediation, sort of community relations approach on the part of not just us as a county, but in neighborhoods and civic associations. There's a void there, I think, a little bit in the community. Some people don't know what to do, but it's been happening more often, but we don't have numbers on it.
It's fine that we don't. I mean, I think it's a general perception that I kind of share, and I just wonder, and Deputy Chief Penn, when you sort of talked about the approach to dealing with noise, it made me think about this from another perspective. You don't actually have to apply the code and the law. It's just merely your presence saying, look, this is causing a problem for someone else, and in the spirit of being a good citizen, can we work to correct it? Yet, Mr. Green, when you come, you don't really have that tool at your disposal. You have a violation notice and a certain amount of time to cure or deal with consequences. And I'm not criticizing you. It's just an overall breakdown that I'd like to figure out how we bridge, where we could get somewhere between that and where you are.
If I can briefly respond, even in that case, there is still a warning, and there is time for a property owner, a violator, a person who would be in violation to correct. My staff don't even use the term violator until past the period of compliance, because if we give you time to take care of it, then education is important, and it's important to note that in most cases, once educated, our constituents, they just, okay, I get it.
Most people do the right.
Yeah.
Most people do the appropriate thing.
Do the right thing.
Mr. Feistat.
Thank you, Mr. Fassett. So, Mr. Green, you indicated early on, although I'm not sure it was part of your slides, that two of the driving forces with respect to building code reported violations are unapproved construction and illegal conversions, conversion from a compliant use to a non-compliant use. So my question is, what is the role of a responsible contractor in this situation? When somebody hires a contractor to make an addition, add an attic, retrofit a garage, revise a basement, that type of thing, they hire a contractor. Do we impose an obligation on that contractor to tell the individual, in my view, based on the work that you're asking me to do, we need to pull a building permit, the obvious benefit of a building permit being safety and inspection afterwards, but also so that the building can catch up with the proper tax assessment. What are the obligations both ways? Let's say that a contractor asks an individual, would you like me to pull the permit, or do you want to go ahead and pull the permit? And the occupant says, don't worry about it, I'll pull the permit. Days, weeks go by, and the guy says, well, I really would like you to start, and the contractor says, okay, and there's no building permit, and it turns out there ought to be. Explain that dynamic.
That's actually more of a me part than the code enforcement part. The regulation that are enforced upon contractors are enforced by DPOR, not the local entity.
Enforced by?
DPOR, Department of Professional Occupational Regulation out of Richmond.
Okay.
So they have the authority. The only thing we do, we can actually report a violation of the Virginia Code to DPOR. DPOR in turn does the investigation and validates that. There is a requirement to obtain a permit. Many times when homeowner comes in and says, I want to get a permit, and the first thing we ask is, do you have a licensed contractor? Although a homeowner can pull a permit, a building owner can pull a permit to build a 100-story office building without having a contract licenses. Those are given, those are given by right to a building owner. If we discourage the homeowner from pulling the permit in their name, because if they do and there is a violation, we need to then issue notice of violation to the homeowner versus the contractor. But the obligation of both parties are that they secure a permit until they begin work. It could be either by the contractor or by the homeowner. The conduct of the contractor is not something that we have a legal authority to do at the county level. It's handled by the State Department of Professional Occupational Regulation.
Okay, so if an incident, if we're made aware of an incident where there has been a problem and this has to go to the state, how do we go about communicating with the state, and do we think that the state's doing a good job here? And also a related question in terms of a bond. I think there was a recent incident with an unfinished foundation in a single-family neighborhood in central Arlington, and the contractor ran out of money, and as it turns out that they weren't bonded. So what happens in that situation? How do we deal with that?
Well, if we know the violator, then we issue a notice of violation. The bonding of a contractor, depending on licensure, almost 99% of them are handled at the state level. The only contract we have a home improvement license contracting in Arlington that requires a bonded contractors, and we actually get the bonding recorded. Literally, we only issue 1 or 2 licenses a year because they don't need the county home improvement contracting license if they have a state one. So all the bonding happens at the state level. Most of the referrals we do is we refer them to the depot. Depot does the investigation. Do they do a good job doing investigation? Yes. Every time a building official submits a request for investigation, they do the investigation. Am I happy with the result of the investigation? Not always.
So but going just, and I may need some more time to follow up with you after this session, but if somebody fails to pull a permit when they were supposed to pull that permit, and we report them to Richmond, who ensures that permit is pulled before work continues, or is this a type of stop work order situation where
we actually issue notes of violation for doing work without a permit. We give them compliance deadline. We also put a stop work order. We have a couple of those cases that recently has happened.
Right.
And if they don't remedy the issue or don't ask for the extension during time period, all the building code violations are class 1 misdemeanor. We take a court action after that.
Okay, that's helpful, but I'll follow up with you. Thank you.
Libby, did you have another question?
I did, thank you. I'd like to follow up a little bit on the issue that Mr. Dorsey brought up, is can we do carrots as well as sticks? I guess I'm interested in how often are these violations with, and I'm sure like with the hoarding and the vegetation and the blight, are these older people who, when they were more able to handle things, were doing fine, probably would like to do the right thing, but are just having a hard time? And it sounds like we help them quite a bit. I'm sort of interested in how large a percentage of the cases that we have are seniors. And do we make it really clear with a notice? Because it sounds like we go and talk to them about how we can help them do things, but do we put it like right out there in the notice, if you need some help complying with this, call this number? I'm assuming we do, but let me know. And then I will invite Mr. Schwartz, if he wants to talk about it at all, to go over the, I was intrigued by your mediation suggestion, Mark. And is there some ways with, these kind of issues between neighbors and residents that come to the board level because everybody's so angry and they can't think of anything else to do, but really ought to be just kind of mediated and not come to us? I don't know if there's a way of putting something in place, and other jurisdictions have that or not, but
okay, let's see what staff responses are.
Oh, okay, well, maybe what I'll do is I'll stage up the mediation issue for the manager, and let you know what we do, Ms. Garvey, in our office when we discover that there are disputes, either with neighbors or with family members. Community mediation, we've had members of community mediation groups come into our team meetings to discuss the effectiveness of it, is a precursor to a court process. Often if you took someone directly to court to try and resolve the issue, the courts are not interested in dealing with the messiness of an issue where people just need to sit down and talk. So they order mediation. We try and encourage persons that contact us to start in the reverse, do the mediation first, and then if it doesn't work, even the invitation, if it doesn't work, you can say, hey, I tried mediation, and the courts can consider the fact that you've tried it and then maybe look over the mediation report and order it. It saves time, saves money. It's certainly much, much cheaper than trying to build a case. But as it relates to the ages of the persons that we're finding that we're placing in violation, they honestly are all over the place. It depends often, I think, where you're from. People come here from all over the world, so whatever they're used to, wherever they have lived, those values come here. And what we're doing is we're attempting to realign those values to what we require here in Arlington. Sometimes it's a little contentious because you just feel how you feel at your home. But once we show them the rules and show them the standards and show them what potentially could happen, what tools we could use to help them get to compliance, they kind of get it, and they'll fall into a compliance path. You spoke of hoarding. The challenge with hoarding is that it's a mental disorder. The results we see by the excessive accumulation of belongings, but it's a mental disorder that needs counseling. And the Department of Human Services, Anita Freeman's group, has worked very, very effectively with police and with fire and with us. We've got a task force that's been in place since, I think, 2005 or so. All right, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments has got a report that was produced by Ben Barksdale, who was a former fire chief here. And that's still a tool that we use and that's used here in the Commonwealth to develop and to administrate a hoarding task force. And so we're getting the work done. We can provide paths to assistance. We have to do an assessment. It's done through our Human Services Department about what their needs are, their income needs. They have information about financing. They have companies that can come in and aid. It tends to be an extremely comprehensive process. It also tends to take quite a while. It's not a snap finger and then it's all gone away. Doing so would send them into a bit of a frenzy. Let me just defer over to the manager.
So, Ms. Garvey, I heard your question. I think that we have had, was what I was recalling, is that when we've had budget conversations where the Tenant Landlord Commission has come in and said, I think there was at one point a position in CPHD that focused on mediation that may have been lost due to budget cuts. But one thing I do want to do is, and I can't do it for you right now, is put together an overview of those places in the county where we have enforcement processes, where we either in the past have used mediation or where there may be room for additional opportunities for mediation if we had additional resources, because I tend to think, and this is based on my experience of the last 10 or 12 years, that there are places where if we had more resources available or was better known, especially to civic associations and people in neighborhoods, that they might take advantage of that. And right now, not through, I think, anybody's fault, but I think if it's something we could actually put some more effort into, might alleviate some of the casework that we have. So I'll put together a response on that again back to the board and the community.
Thank you, Libby.
I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. And this has all been excellent. And that might sort of fold into the whole discussion we've had sometimes about civility and how we work together as a community. So I think it's great. Thank you.
I'm going to ask that we have about 10 minutes left, and we're going to do a little speed round with one quick question and one quick answer, if you have one. If you don't, fine. Mine is just to raise the issue of what's in the county board office known as a petition. I think this was established some years ago, where if a citizen writes in and they are really looking for a change in the ordinance, they may have a complaint, they may have a question, but in the end, it's deemed to be a question about should we in fact change the ordinance. They don't all deal with code enforcement, but some of them do. And the question really is to the manager's office, when you get those, what do you do with them? And you know, is that, we've asked about going to the state for new authority, and we've kind of heard we have the kind of authority we need at the state. Might there be examples where actually tweaking of our own ordinance might be justified and worth the time and energy? And you have to judge that because of the amount of time and your workload and all, but is that a path that still has, is still workable? Because we get a handful of those, half a dozen or so a year, I would think.
That's correct, but we usually get requests for changes to the zoning ordinance, not to the codes. So I think that, I mean, that's not what we're focusing on today, obviously, but zoning ordinances, you are aware of all the ones that we've received, and usually the board will prioritize among those and let us know which ones we should put them in our work program, and we work on them as
We
time
do
is
get
available.
some, though, that are
But on
around some of these code enforcement issues, and we would always get something back from you that might say, yes, we think it has validity, no, we don't, or that it'll go on a list for consideration, right?
Let's say, in the last 2 years, I don't recall any of those. Gabriella would have a better memory than me on that, and I don't actually recall any from the past 5 years. It may be that there have been individuals who come in and say that I think that we certainly hear specific instances of complaints about how the ordinance may be enforced, but never, I can't recall anything about changing the ordinance, perhaps with the one exception of this thing about the height of grass and certain lawns, and asking us to take a look at that. That's the only one from the past 12 months.
Okay, I'll follow up with you on that one then if necessary. I've gone through my speed moment here. I'm only allowing a minute and a half a person. Katie?
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay. Christian, anything?
I think Katie's yielded her time to me. And actually, not a question, really a comment. You know, this has really been enlightening, and generally, I am very much interested in figuring out how we get beyond the 3,500 cases of either proactive or complaint-based enforcement to getting better outcomes in our community, because I think really underneath all of this is that we have certain standards for our community that we'd like to see applied in as many places as possible, not just in areas that we may either self-identify as problematic or that people may identify for us as problematic. And I'd also like to get past this whole idea that these wonderful inspectors in these wonderful crisp white uniforms are people to be feared. You know, you've outlined a work plan that we provide help for people, informative articles, and I'd like to see that we maybe think about expanding that, Mr. Manager, so that we could, you know, provide technical expertise for civic associations to do cleanup days when we're dealing with some of these seasonal issues with vegetative growth. And, you know, we've had a pilot program of lending out snow blowers. Maybe that could be applied to people who could help, you know, certain times of the year trim problem areas, and maybe bringing cherry pickers to deal with trees that we know, you know, overhang the public right-of-way, but those sorts of things that are creating better outcomes in our community so that we can begin to create a greater sense that code enforcement is not really the state putting its thumb on the scale, but really about creating the kind of necessary not only aesthetic outcomes, but health and environment outcomes that we all desire. So thank you all very much.
John?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Fazette. So with respect to, you mentioned condominiums and that appears, and that there might be a little bit of a trend towards more concern on the commercial side, relatively speaking, or percentage-wise. What sort of outreach and coordination, Mr. Sharia, are we doing with, or Mr. Amiri, are we doing with respect to the Apartment Association, the Chamber of Commerce, NIOP, and other commercial real estate groups? Is that a good avenue? I would imagine we're doing some of that now.
Not specifically regarding to the maintenance of the commercial building, because once the NAIOP, we meet with NAIOP on a quarterly basis based on development that's coming to the building. And to frankly address your question, we haven't strategized how to reach out those private buildings, condominium buildings, but we see more and more of them. Some of them happens at the regional shopping centers, parking garages get in there. So in that case, we go directly to the owner rather. And the things that concerns us, we generally don't walk in somebody's apartment, knock on the door, things that we can see from observe from outside. Balconies dilapidating, parking garages cracking. And we've been just individually dealing with that building. We have a couple facades that over the years and because of our development, need a major repairs that can be a public safety issue. So we are starting to see that, and we are actually building some capacity in code enforcement with some expertise to be able to address those that were not typically part of the program. So I brought that up because that's going to be the next challenge for me, for Mr. Green and I to tool our inspectors to deal with that trend that we see it coming.
So that's why I'm wondering if some networking with those trade associations might be fruitful.
And that may be. I do have a regular monthly meeting with a group of contractors, but they tend to be more residential in nature, and we'll probably can put the word out through the bids, through the chamber, that this is starting to show some concerns around the county.
Great, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Libby, did you have a final question?
No, mostly just wanted to thank people for, and you, Mr. Facette, for working to bring this about, because I think it gave us a window onto a really important and really, I think, little understood part of the services that we, provide our residents. I'm intrigued by the changes that Mr. Amiri and others are talking about that could be coming up. So it was extremely helpful. Thank you. And I hadn't thought before as code enforcement as a way of helping to build community, but now I do. And I think there's some even, good changes that can come about. And thanks very much for doing that.
Thank you. Okay, well, we're going to leave. I just wanted to identify that I mentioned this to Katie a minute ago. It's really impressive to me, the talent around the table and what you all are doing on behalf of the county in a way that most of us don't see every day.
Your call cannot be completed
as dialed. 997 out of 1,000 that kind of work through the system. But we do, and we always hear, and it's always helpful to us to gauge and help inform our responses and our ability to respond to constituents to know better exactly what it is you are doing. So thanks for a very good presentation. We're adjourned.
Thank you. Come by. That's actually, I have to say that that's